I'd like us all to take a moment. A poll will pop up in a second. And what's the first thing you think about when you think of the term autism? And if you could put that in the chat when there's a poll. There it is. All right. And type in a word. What's your first thought? It could be anything. We're playing word association. And we should start seeing it, I believe. There we go. I'll give us another 20 seconds to get these all in here. Wow. Okay. I'm going to put a hard stop on that. I think what we can see here clearly is we all have a very different idea of what autism is, and that's the point. We're here, next slide, please. We're here to kind of unpack some of that together and see if we can come up with some common language and understandings about autism. And I'm gonna give Dean a chance to introduce us some more.
Thank you. We are caregivers and professionals alike, and we all have different experiences and understandings about people with autism and experience and mental illness. And what we've been taught about autism doesn't always apply to us and our loved ones because we're all taught differently about autism. And our conversations become very complicated and advocacy becomes harder. And this is what brought the group of us together for this particular Unlearn. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Adine. I'm mother, caregiver to a 26-year-old son who is autistic, is a psychiatric service user, has multiple complex needs. I'm also a post-secondary educator, and I'll pass on to Nathan.
Hi, I'm Nathan. I go by any and all pronouns, and I have a 23-year-old son who's autistic and also has a developmental disability and deals with mental illness, including suicidality. I'm also, in my other life, I'm an anthropologist. And I'm going to pass it on to Riley to introduce herself briefly.
Hi, my name is Riley. I'm 22 years old and I am autistic. And today I'm here to speak with you all about autism as an identity, as a community, and what communication can look like. And I will pass it on to Karim.
Hello there, I'm Karim. I'm almost 29 years old and I have Asperger's syndrome. And I currently work in the media, and I do have some stories just to share, some narratives to share to add more perspective to this lunch and Unlearn.
Yeah, go ahead, Leanne.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and introduce myself. And my introduction is going to be a little bit longer because not only am I introducing myself, but I am introducing why we're having an Unlearn on Autism. So, good question. Why? As for most topics in this series, I will only speak for myself and my own experiences. So unlearning. We spend most of our lives learning, and most of the time what we learn is built on a foundation of prior knowledge, prior information that we've already learned. So we know that we can't multiply until we've learned how to add, and we can't add until we've learned how to count. And all of our learning is really entirely dependent on what we already know. But what happens when we realize that what we thought was true isn't exactly accurate? And how do we apply new knowledge when we don't really even understand the basics? And that was my autism story. I became aware that my daughter was autistic shortly before she turned 18. Her diagnosis really shocked me from multiple perspectives. Firstly, she didn't look autistic, and I say that with quotes on purpose. At that point, I'd been working in the school system for over 25 years, and my educational background is in developmental psychology. I supported resource teachers, I worked as a psychoeducational consultant, and I really thought that I knew autism. My daughter did not fit the image that I had formed throughout all of those years. I wasn't completely oblivious. We had spent years seeing countless therapists and doctors to help her manage her anxiety, her depression, her feelings of isolation, her thoughts of suicide, and our family was in crisis, and we knew there was a problem. But autism, that was not one of the diagnoses that had ever been suggested. I have a master's degree in psychology. I thought I understood everything there was to know about autism. My daughter is well-spoken. She makes eye contact. She understands the rules and subtleties of language. She understands nonverbal cues. I could not, it made no sense to me at all. Everything that I thought that I knew about autism had to be thrown out the window. What my daughter taught me was that everything that I had learned was wrong, was misleading. And I discovered that I really needed to dismantle those beliefs and to see the connection between her mental health and autism. Throughout this journey, I had to unlearn a lot of terminology, a lot of jargon, a lot of words, and I had to build on new information in order to best support her and the autistic community. I needed to unlearn everything that I already knew in order to appreciate that there was nothing wrong with my daughter, but rather living in a world that was not designed for her was living in a daily assault. I needed to unlearn in order to know that she didn't need to change, but that the world around her and the systems that were in place to support autistic adults needed to change. And since I did mention that I used to work in the school system, I'll also add that I will never get over the shame that I have in how I supported autistic youth, because I didn't have an understanding. I don't believe that I properly supported autistic youth who didn't use language to communicate or oral language to communicate. And I wish I had had an opportunity to unlearn some of that information. So that's a little bit of my story and why we're here. And it might lead you, certainly led me to ask why the idea of autism is so unclear. And it likely has to do with the very long history of autism, which Nathan, Aideen, and Riley will now touch on.
Next slide, please. Thanks, Leanne. So before we had the language of disability and the term autism, attitudes to anything outside of accepted norms varied from culture to culture. In Europe, those with certain visible disabilities or those who acted weird were often met with a mix of fear and pity, or hidden away and cared for by families or the church. In some cultures, people with disabilities had a special place or role. In others, including our own, they were often seen as a pollution to the gene pool and often sterilized and murdered in some times and contexts. Other people, those so-called savants and eccentrics, from Leonardo da Vinci to Einstein, have become idolized and celebrated in our culture. Mm-hmm.
If we actually look at the meaning, autism defined, it's a Greek word for self and morbid self-admiration. And now this got lumped together historically with schizophrenia, with psychopathology, and also Asperger syndrome. And that was then recognized, Asperger's, as, quote, high functioning. I'd like to hand over to Riley to say a little bit more about Asperger's.
As an autistic person, I'm distressed and hurt by a lot of the history of the disorder with which I was diagnosed. Autism is a term that has been used for over 100 years, and its definition has changed countless times. And such a long and varied history of the word autism has resulted in countless harmful myths and outdated terms relating to autism spectrum disorder, as we call it today. And I want to take this time to teach you why these misconceptions and outdated terms are harmful to the autistic community. And as I coach you through these languages and myths, please know that I am not here to judge. I am only here to share a different perspective, as this is an unlearn after all. And I really could talk for ages about these, but I set a word count limit for your sake. So my apologies, because it definitely already went on a little bit too long. The first outdated term that I want to talk about that was brought up is Asperger's syndrome. Asperger's was originally coined in 1944 by Hans Asperger, a Nazi doctor who contributed to the false belief that an autistic person's worth is based on their usefulness. Asperger's was retired as a diagnosis later due to Hans Asperger's controversies and also the simple lack of distinction between Asperger's and autism. And I know that there are many folks who were diagnosed with Asperger's and are reluctant to change the way that they describe themselves. I get it because I was diagnosed in 2017, 4 years after it was taken out of the DSM, and I was still diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, formerly known as Asperger's. But today, what Asperger's represents is anti-Semitic and ableist, and it's one term that is now outdated, and I think that the community should follow in that. So I will pass this back on to continue.
Thank you for that, Riley. And that's really interesting because my own son was originally diagnosed with Asperger's. And looking further at the diagnosis, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders was created to see autism as a diagnosis. It was seen as a reliable research, accurate diagnosis, and appropriate treatment for mental conditions.
And the DSM-3 in 1980 was actually the first time that autism was even mentioned in the DSM, and it was only recognized in children.
And then following that, it was divided into 16 different criteria, including different aspects of life. This included different diagnoses, different disorders, including autism, Asperger's, PTD, Rett's, and child disintegrative disorder.
And as science and the clinicians, they noticed at that time that actually autism was getting overdiagnosed. So they revamped, and when they revamped, they found it was getting underdiagnosed. So we finally come to the autism spectrum as a disorder, and 3 levels of severity are how it's defined. That's where we get the terms high and low functioning. And it's generally seen as an impairment of two-way communication and interaction and repetitive patterns of behavior. Again, there are 5 criteria and 5 categories of needs. This is just a basic sum if you just need to know. And Riley, can you tell us a little bit more about high and low functioning and some issues with those terms?
Yes, please. You all know how much I love to talk. So another outdated term that we find still often used, but maybe it shouldn't be, are functioning labels such as high functioning and low functioning. These labels have been thrust upon us as autistic people as though they alone can describe or encapsulate one's abilities. Who decides how well one functions on a daily basis? The functioning labels are determined by an outside observer based on their idea of what one's daily functioning looks like. I, for example, am highly verbal, because I never stop talking, with an above average IQ. And when I was diagnosed in 2017, I was told that I was high functioning. Except at the time, I didn't feel high functioning, and I actually still don't. I'm not in school, I live in my parents' house, I don't have my own bank account. And these are some basic adult milestones that I just can't participate in because of my actual difficulties functioning, not just what one doctor who met me for a couple of hours believed. We don't benefit from these labels because function is a spectrum that is in flux every single day. High functioning is used to deny resources, and low functioning is used to deny agency. I will pass this on to, I think, Leanne.
Well, I don't like having to follow you because you are so well spoken. So I tried to speak to you folks earlier using another screen that actually went blank. So I'm not going to try and use any script. I'm just going to speak to you now and hope that it makes sense, because really this is what this visual is what I understood when my daughter was diagnosed. I was told that I was lucky, that she was less autistic, in the less autistic part of the spectrum, that she was high functioning, that she actually had the good kind of autism. Given what we saw every day in our house and at night, I actually couldn't imagine what the bad kind of autism was if this was the good kind of autism. I heard this language from physicians, from therapists, from friends, other caregivers. And what actually ultimately I felt like as a caregiver was somebody who really didn't have the right to talk about the difficulty that it was having caring for an autistic adult, somebody who was diagnosed a little bit later, because everybody else had a more autistic child or a lower functioning child. And I really felt as though I had no community. When I tried to engage with other caregivers, I felt excluded. I felt like I didn't belong. I felt that because my daughter was diagnosed later, I didn't know if I had a place in the autistic caregiver community. And it took a really long time for me to understand that these labels were incredibly harmful, not just to my daughter, but to our entire family. So we're working on unlearning that, and we're working on teaching our clinicians to unlearn it also. And Riley, I will hand off to you again.
The part that I love most about this is that it really is an unlearn, but also a learn, just a regular learn as well. And I hope that we can continue that for the rest of this presentation. One myth that I want to talk about that this graph brings up is the idea that we're all a little bit autistic. And I'm sure many of you have heard this before. To clear things up, you can't be a little bit autistic. You either are or you aren't. It's called autism spectrum disorder because of the spectrum of experiences belonging to autistic people, not because it's a linear scale of how autistic you are, from less to more, as it says on the left side of this page. Your mileage may vary, but your diagnosis won't. It's also not nearly the comfort nor the compliment that people seem to think it is by saying we're all a little bit autistic or you're just a little bit autistic. By maintaining that everybody's a little bit autistic, the severity and uniquely traumatic experiences of this disorder are being downplayed and undermined. And if you look at the list of autism symptoms and you're thinking to yourself, okay, well, come on, everyone experiences that. You might be more than a little bit autistic. So, if the spectrum doesn't look the way it does on the left side of your screen, what does it look like? If you look at the image to your right, you'll see a pie chart where each slice is a type of function with 6 arcs in each piece denoting an individual's proficiency in each of them. For example, the hypothetical person shown here seems extraordinarily well-rounded, with perfect marks in each category. Very good for them. Unfortunately, most people, life is not this simple. Even non-autistic folks can be put into this graph, but they'll probably have less varied results than we do. Autistic people will have more diverse scores generally, potentially scoring very high in sensory, perception, and motor skills, for example, but quite low in language or verbal processing. This person might be nonverbal, but still incredibly talented in other areas. I'll explain a little bit more about this later. Next.
Yeah, thank you. That was definitely a learn. I would like to invite Karim to speak to us a little bit about your experiences, Kareem, because we can talk for ages as caregivers, but hearing from you and Riley, I think, is going to have the most impact for all of us here. So the floor is yours.
Okay, excellent. So really what I wanted to speak about in this is as an autistic adult, there is always frequently a disconnect in terms of what I'm trying to say and communicate, and in terms of what ends up being received at the other end. So I'll start with this narrative. So I'm 22 years old. My parents suddenly are divorced with very little explanation, I might add. And then with more changes in where I was going to live, couldn't live in that where I was anymore, so had to move, had to leave where I'd already started building my career. And now suddenly I'm getting attacked from all sides. And as I tried to explain, to those who were questioning, what are you going to do with yourself now? Like, what's your problem? What's your plan? And so I'm trying to explain, well, this just happened, and I'm trying to now figure out where I'm going to go. I'm not sure if I want to stay in this field anymore, given the layoffs that were going on, and I'm not even sure. And so instead of that message coming across as confusion, which it was, it comes across as laziness, or it comes across as blaming, or it comes across as being self-centered. So, the responses you get is shame, be real, get real, life's tough. And you should be ashamed of yourself, all your parents have done for you, and you're not a kid anymore. Get up, get a job, get a real job, whatever. So all this is building in my mind. All of this, to the point where I it led to some breakdowns. I'll be honest, they did. I just couldn't. There seemed no way out of this sudden being thrown into a foreign world. Now, of course, the problem is you express that, guess who gets called? 911 gets called. They send 3 armed officers up, when someone's having an anxiety attack, 3 armed officers is the last thing that's going to help. Is going to help the situation. Let me just say that. And
Like,
I remember.
I'm
I'm sorry. You want me to stop? Okay.
No, I definitely don't want you to stop. I just actually am wondering if you might tell us a little bit about what was happening that led to 911 being called.
Yeah, so basically what was going on is basically these I'm not sure if microaggressions is the word, but all that I was describing earlier with getting all of those kind of verbal attacks, what happens is you can't escape them. Like it affects everything you do, everything you try and focus on, or try and even just try to relax. These things continue to replay, to the point where you just want them all to stop. You want the situation to go away, but it doesn't. So, I out of panic and frustration, and I have a mother who suffers from anxiety. It would build to a point where I remember that day she actually ran out of the house because she was just out of anxiety, and a neighbor called 911. Just, again, reporting the situations, I found out later, reporting the situation as domestic abuse. Again, the case of how it looks versus the truth. So, these officers come storming up, yelling my name and all of that, and before they've even heard before I've been able to say anything, my mother's just freaking out, this and that, and he was this and he was that, and and the officer just turned, and I'll never forget what he said, and I still shudder to this day when this memory comes back. If he's not pulling his weight around here, kick him out. I'm shuddering as I just said it. That is how it looks. He doesn't know me. He doesn't know all that I've given to my industry. He doesn't know all the work that I put in. He doesn't know all that I've done for no payment. But that's how it looks. So there's just one narrative, you know. There's more narratives right up till today, but we can save those for later. But
Kareem, I'm wondering if you can, somebody put in the chat, and I think it would be helpful, given that what you were communicating was not what the people around you were hearing, what would you have needed in that moment?
well, I think what I needed in that moment and what I still need in this moment, because I feel, you know, it's almost, and I feel like it's gotten even worse as I've gotten to become an adult. I feel that they're just, my language and the language that is being received from out there is different. It's foreign. Again, if I'd had maybe some sort of mediation, maybe would have helped. Some sort of someone in the middle who could have communicated what it is that I was trying to say. I think maybe that could have helped, but it's tough because you don't have those people just, you know, at your disposal. It's on speed dial all the time.
Thank you, Kareem. Sorry, Adine, go ahead.
Can I just ask one thing, Kareem, about how that's carried over also in your work situation? Is it
Okay.
account of that?
I can speak about sort of what I've just been going through in the past couple months, if that's what you're looking for.
Yeah.
So again, this disconnect. So here I am in my current role. I'm in Kingston. I'm 3-4 hours away from my caregivers, and so I found myself in a situation where it was like things were just kind of getting thrown at me, and it was like, well, you know, you should have known, right? Like, yeah. In a recent example, I was in a staff meeting with the assistant manager because the actual manager doesn't come in. And basically, you know, I was told, you know, oh, you're doing this and you're doing that. And I said, but and we're not doing that though. That doesn't make sense. Oh, no, you're doing. I think we're doing that. That's how we do things here. And I, you know, I got a little bit expressive, but I contained myself. I didn't threaten anybody. I got a little bit expressive, like this doesn't make any sense. You know, why are you just, you know, it's like I'm at the bottom of the well and more is just getting dumped without any communication along the way. Now, a couple weeks later, what I found out was is I got called in and to the manager's office, who suddenly decided to come in, and I was just reamed out with no active defense. I couldn't defend. I was told that my behavior was hostile and aggressive and all of these things. And I couldn't believe it, considering, you know, I had even apologized and I had even you know, I just had asked for some basic communication, but this is the way that this was being seen and treated. Fast forward, you know, now I obviously have anxiety around this manager. So, you know, I tried to avoid her the last time she was around. You know, just tried to, you know, if I saw her coming, okay, I'll go to another room. I was called out and referred to as passive aggressive. And now I'm not even allowed to go into the station. I'm still working for them, but I can't even go in because suddenly, you know, everyone is unsafe because, as she put it, it's not just about you.
Could I add to that?
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's extremely interesting, especially that we talked earlier about, you know, the controversies surrounding the term Asperger's. I think that
Mm-hmm.
it's really relevant to your stories because, especially, you know, what you said the police officer said in the previous story, and how you are still working where you're working now, but you're not allowed to be with other people. Is
Mm-hmm.
that not segregation based on your worth? Is that not, is the police officer telling your mom, you know, throw out your child because they're not pulling their weight, or a workplace telling you they don't like your personal or social features, so don't come in but continue to do work for us. Because I
Yeah.
mean, it might just be me being biased because I've experienced many of the same things, albeit on a different level. Because I am, you know, I'm white, I'm female, I'm very small, so
Mm.
generally people aren't threatened by me ever. But I've been in a lot of the same situations where I recognize that point hits me of, you don't like me, but you like what I can bring to the table. My autism is only relevant, it is only positive for the worth of other people. And that's why I've always hated the term high functioning as well, because it is, what is high functioning uh, to the outside world? What do other people think of me? How can I help them? It's not really about us or our diagnoses, right?
You're right on with that because, and I think, and there's a lot of unwritten rules sort of
Mhm.
that I'm just starting to figure out, to be honest.
Yeah.
Like even, I'll give you another quick example. About a month ago, that same assistant manager, as I was already starting to go for my own lunch that I had already packed, and I didn't want the meat to go bad. It had been a couple days, and I'm suddenly told, please join us. We're ordering an Indian food, and I'm like, but I can't. I already packed lunch. I'm sorry, but I got to go. Suddenly, that was reported as hostile behavior. And again, and I was shamed over that. And again, it's like pull up, a chair where the others are working. Go with them for drinks after work. I never been invited for drinks, but
Yeah.
again, see, it's a sense of be who you're supposed to be or get out. That's
Also,
kind of the vibe I'm getting. Yeah.
right, and
Mhm.
our responses to
Mhm.
changes in our routine, confusion, misunderstanding,
Mhm.
requests, they are we're confused, and we are trying to rein in our emotions and doing the analytics in our head to figure out our
Mhm.
schedule. Um, but outwardly, maybe we're frustrated, maybe we're seen
Mhm.
as saying, I don't want to do this. That's not it. We're just
Yeah.
frustrated in the change in our routine. And then that is seen as you said, hostile.
And I'm sorry, I wish I had solutions, but yet that's the question is how do we navigate this when what we're trying to put out there is being seen in a completely different light that's even taking me months to even begin to even understand what's even being seen.
Right. I think that the solution is, unlearning. We have
Yeah.
here our caregivers, we have some practitioners, and these are people that have, for the most part, maybe lived a lot of their lives around autistic people. But even with that being a truth, you're not necessarily asking their opinions. And if you
Mm.
do, you might not be equipped to understand their answers. So that's why we are here. We have brought in these facilitators and these advisors who speak the same language as our audience here, and try to bridge that gap of miscommunication and misunderstanding. Um, yeah.
I want to slowly though bring it back to the caregivers because I think what's in a way I think it's also a shock to the system for caregivers because like I feel like my parents don't want to see this going on because I'm sure it pains them to first of all either be in the same room seeing this happen or seeing it from 4 hours away. But the problem is they probably feel like, well, what can we do? Like that's the problem. Because it's one thing if you're a child living with your parents and you have it because they can, whatever, call the teacher and all of that. But in this case, like my parents couldn't do a thing. Like I had my mother on the phone when I was being confronted by that manager just recently before I was sentenced to being under his house arrest. And basically, the manager hurled insults at her, calling her sick, and I don't want to hear from your mother, you know? right? So there's no longer suddenly now it's harder to say what can a caregiver do in this point. They can listen, but that's about it. And sometimes I think it actually pains them to hear it. I think
I agree.
sometimes there's also that too.
I agree. And I think that that pain comes from a place of love because they want to understand so badly. They want to fix it. They want the solutions. And unfortunately, it's not that cut and dry. So I think I'd like to move into a further point, which is community and communication surrounding autism. And it can be a bit complex, and I promise it actually has to do with what we were just talking about. But today you've already helped to answer an extraordinarily difficult question, which is, what is autism? And as you've seen from the beginning of this slideshow with our word cloud, the answer isn't really clear. And even in the DSM, the official diagnostic description of autism is over 10 pages long. So the answer to the question, what is autism, is really unique to every individual, even to those who aren't autistic. Caregivers also have their own definition of the word. So when I tell you today that I want to speak about autism as an identity and as a community, I know that I'm asking a lot of both myself and of you. Autism means so many different things to so many different people. So how can I represent all autistic people and all of their experiences and feelings? I will tell you right now, I can't. I am not here to represent your loved ones or to speak for them. I am only here to teach you about my experiences and perceptions, the concept of autism as a community, and I challenge, welcome, and encourage you to consider my experiences, to see them from a different perspective, and to better understand your loved ones. So let's talk about autism as a community. A community is defined as a group of people having a particular characteristic in common. Obviously, in the autistic community, one could say that the characteristic tying us all together is being autistic. But personally, I think that's a bit of a cop-out. And it might be a clearer thing to ask, what shapes the autistic identity? What makes autistic people similar to each other, but different to others? One trait that unites many autistic people is social isolation. Usually, we're isolated for reasons beyond our control, like bullying and exclusion. For those reasons, many autistic folks actually prefer the company of our autistic peers. They understand us better. We have no need to spend our energy following the secret hidden rules of non-autistic social interactions. Like Karim, you were saying, talking to neurotypical people sometimes can be a bit confusing because they have all of their little social rules, especially surrounding invitations. I know for myself, I have to be explicitly invited to something to know that I am allowed to go there. My own cousin, who is one of my best friends in the entire world, was telling me about a party that she was going to have the next day, and I had spent the entire night excited for her party. It was only 4 hours later when she texted me saying, "You know you're invited to that, right?" I did not know. These are some secret rules that I was expected to parse, but had no idea how. Plus, all of the strange work quirks that we have that are considered weird and unacceptable by non-autistic or allistic people are respected. But more than being respected, accepted, and understood by our autistic peers, we also understand them. It's a reciprocal relationship. In our community, there are no hidden rules to follow and no need to decode them. As autistic adults, we often feel misunderstood in a world that also misunderstands us. The autistic experience has on countless occasions been compared to visiting a foreign country where you don't understand the language and no one can understand you. This is why so many consider autism to be a social communication disorder, but communication is a complex idea that shapes our identities more than you know and probably more than you understand right now. Communication is more than just talking. There are many alternate forms of communication or communicative mediums that reach much farther than the spoken word. I like to call these alternate communication forms languages. So if you remember back to the graph that we saw earlier in that circle where perception, sensory, motor skills, and verbal language were all pieces, consider all of these as different communication languages. Communication exists to get needs met. It's natural, and it's something that we know how to do from birth, even though we don't know it. Babies scream and cry when they need something because they don't know how to speak English. So they scream and they cry. That's the language that they use to say, I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, I need to be changed, I'm tired, because they don't know how to say those words. Adults are able to communicate in more complex ways that reach, forms of understanding. Generally, the languages that adults speak are the same. You speak English, you're talking to someone else who speaks English, you're going to understand each other in this conversation. Adults who have autism or other neurodevelopmental disabilities often have difficulties speaking English the way that we are taught is the only valid way of communication. There is so much more than verbal language when speaking to another person that is a type of valid communication, especially since these alternate forms are much more not popular, but widespread in the autistic community than in the neurotypical community. We have higher autonomy and are able to think complexly, so we can come up with new forms of communication. For example, art. Art is a beautiful style of communication that people often don't realize is one. When you go to a museum and you see a piece of art on the wall and it makes you feel something, and that feeling turns into thoughts in your mind, you have just been communicated to through the artist, through a new form of communication that you're probably not used to because we spend most of our lives communicating verbally. In autistic people, we have these innate abilities to communicate in ways that we aren't necessarily taught through English, like the physical language of violence or movement or dance or stimming. These are ways to communicate. Stimming means I'm happy or I'm overwhelmed, depending on the context. But that is a physical language that they are using to tell the people around them, this is how I feel right now. And it needs to be more validated because they're beautiful. There are other languages. No one language is more valid than another, but we have to change our understanding of what language is to accept these forms that our autistic loved ones speak. When we take a step back from our beliefs of what valid communication looks like, you might find that your loved ones don't need to speak to communicate at all as long as you are willing to listen. What unites the autistic community is our unique and beautiful ability to communicate at a level that non-autistic people often cannot. Autism is thought of as a developmental disability that can create communication challenges on a social level, but the reality is we are exceptionally good at communicating, just not in the way that society expects us to. Before I finish up, I have a couple more misconceptions and myths that I want to bring to light and debunk. Another one is that autistic people don't feel empathy or emotions. Again, I'm sure a lot of you have heard this one. Autistic people often feel on a much stronger level than A-list-6 or non-autistic people, actually. And the level of emotions and the degree of empathy that we can feel is often super overwhelming. It's the processing and communication of these emotions that really differentiate autistic people from A-listic people in this specific misconception anyways. Autistic people who aren't prolific verbal communicators can have difficulty expressing and explaining their intense emotions, which can feed into this myth. While they may feel hyper-emotional, if they have difficulty using words to explain the feeling, or they don't use the socially correct facial expressions or body language, then they may incorrectly be considered unemotional or using the wrong emotions. Kareem, as you were saying earlier, I think that that was a perfect example of what you had gone through, where you were trying to express different emotions such as confusion or, you know, anger and sadness with your parents splitting without, you know, the proper understanding of that. You were misinterpreted in your emotionality to be hostility or uncaring. And that's unfair that you were speaking the language that you understand, but you weren't being listened to in that same language. Another misconception that I wasn't originally going to add, but I really, really needed to bring up is that an autism diagnosis is a condemnation. It is not. Autistic people have the capacity and the capability to be successful, intelligent, empathetic, incredible individuals, just like everybody else. Yes, in many areas, we start a lot further from the finishing line than our neurotypical peers, but there are areas where we excel far beyond them too. Our capacity for falling in love with the world exceeds the norm. Our lifetimes are filled with routines and special interests, which have been unfairly categorized as negative symptoms instead of what they could be, which are gifts. My routines give me safety and stability. My special interests give me joy and passion. Of course, there are downsides to autism, but that is true for just about anything. But to say that there is nothing positive, nothing beautiful about the way that my community understands the world is just untrue. We see the world in a different way, not in a better way, just a different one. And I really challenge all of you when you go back to your autistic loved ones to say, what language are you speaking? How can I understand it? And how can I communicate back? Thank you.